Great. Well, welcome to Nintendo Alert Live. It has been around 7 months since I've done a podcast, and I figured this week is better than any other, given the immense news we've had this week. And so, to recap all the news to this point, we had the reveal trailer drop early on the morning of the 16th. And from there, it's just been a nonstop parade of news, of speculation, of hype. But that's not the case for everybody. And so we'll get into that in a few minutes here. But to talk a little bit about what that Switch 2 revealed included, some exciting new features. And so, number one, it's larger. I think that was pretty much a given from the get-go, that we expected the Switch 2 would be larger than the Switch 1, but it is. It's got a larger screen, it's got larger Joy-Cons, it has a new dock, which is exciting. The dock stops about halfway up the screen versus all the way up in the original Switch, which is interesting. There's an extra USB-C port on the top. There's an upgraded kickstand, a magnetic Joy-Con attachment system. We saw Mario Kart 9 in the trailer, which is pretty cool. And there's apparently potential mouse support as well, which is super interesting. Another thing that is really exciting about the Switch 2 for the trailer is backwards compatibility on most Switch games, but not all. They were very clear to say not all Switch games. And I suspect that this is for those kind of weird one-off games like the Mario Kart that is actually like a remote control car that drives around your house, and like Labo, and sort of the things that are already barely supported. I think there's a high likelihood it is more effort than it's worth to port those things to the Switch 2. And so I would expect to see 99% of games probably being A-okay to be backwards compatible on the Switch 2, but probably just that weird stuff on the fringes that has, additional peripherals or accessories. It seems like that will be no good on the Switch 2, but that's okay. So backwards compatibility is also exciting because it's not just digital games, right? So physical games will work on the Switch 2. It'll be able to accept those, which is great for somebody like me who buys all of their games because there's, infinite value to physically possessing the media and being able to resell it and whatever it is you want to do, right? And then additionally, we learned that there's going to be a Nintendo Direct with full information on the Nintendo Switch 2 hardware coming out on April 2nd, which was probably not coincidentally, but intentionally 2 months, 2 weeks, and 2 days away from the reveal trailer, which was itself 2 minutes and 22 seconds long. So Nintendo knew what they were doing with that. A fun little Easter egg for you. And then finally, we learned that there are going to be some hands-on Nintendo Switch 2 experiences available to sign up for and to potentially win a chance to use the Nintendo Switch 2 to try out the games before anybody else in the world. And so there are quite a few across the world that are going to be available. You have to go and enter for a chance to win a time slot, a ticket. And if you win, you get to play with the Nintendo Switch 2. And if you don't win, you get to read about it on the computer. That's just how it is. But with all of this, some controversy has emerged, right? I think reception to the Switch 2 has largely been positive, but there's a contingent of folks who feel kind of let down. I think people worry that Nintendo has lost its drive to innovate, which if you know Nintendo, you know it has been known to do over the years, right? You think back to the Nintendo Entertainment System and all the gimmicks that came with the original NES. Rob the Robot, you had the Power Pad, you had the NES Zapper. On the Super Nintendo, you had the Super Scope kind of bazooka thing, right? The Nintendo 64, Nintendo practically invented the 3D platformer genre. The GameCube was a cube. That's really all it kind of had going for it. The Wii brought motion controls that kind of set the world on fire. If you were around for Christmas 2006, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The Wii U had the gamepad, which wound up being a predecessor to the Nintendo Switch, which in and of itself was revolutionary in terms of it being a hybrid of like a desktop standard console you plug into the TV, while also being a portable, which brings us to Nintendo's history of inventing the portable genre, right? They brought the Game Boy out, the Game Boy Color, the Game Boy Advance, the SP with the backlit screen, right? And then on to the DS, which turned into the 3DS. And so you can see how something more iterative like the Switch 2 could disappoint people who were hoping for the next big thing rather than an improvement on what already exists, right? That said, we still don't have all the details. I strongly suspect at some point in the April 2nd Nintendo Direct for the Switch 2, we're going to get some form of surprise that we weren't expecting. That's my guess, is that they have left some information in the background for us to discover. There's a lot of leaks when it comes to the hardware. We pretty much know exactly what that's going to look like. But what we don't know is sort of what about it, right? We know that there's this optical sensor, but what does that do? We know that there's this extra button that's being called the C button. We don't know what that does, right? We know that there's an extra USB-C port on the top, but is there any sort of peripheral that's designed for that? I've seen some speculation that there could be an additional screen that you could purchase for the Switch 2. It's really hard to know at this point because we have so little information about the actual sort of use of that hardware. And so we know seemingly everything about what it's going to play like, about what the machine itself is, but we don't have the additional information on what it's like. And so, with all that said, there is still definitely some consternation about some things with the Switch 2 release. And so some of the loudest of that comes from some concerns about the graphical fidelity of the console, right? And so we've heard some feedback about the screen recording of Mario Kart 9 that shows up on the trailer and how it looks a little cartoony and how it looks a lot like Mario Kart 8. But then we've also seen some concerns about the actual hardware that's been announced and sort of like a dreading of the fact that it doesn't seem like it's enough of a graphical leap. But before we get into the graphics, because that's really the meat and potatoes of this, I just wanted to detour to talk about some other nitpicks that I've heard about this. And I find them sort of interesting because I think that it's more like a personal reflection than anything else. But there are a few things that I've sort of seen, but I think the big underlying theme is people looking for potential points of failure on the Switch 2 hardware. And so I think part of that comes from being like once bitten, twice shy about like Joy-Con drift and screen scratches and software bugs. And so we're going to hear a lot about that in terms of people saying, well, you know, the original Switch had Joy-Con drift. I hope this one doesn't have Joy-Con drift, or it better not, or it's going to, or some sort of dooming about the potential for that to happen. I think the odds of that happening are fairly low. When you consider the fact that Nintendo in 2017 launched the Switch to widespread reports of like, you know, those bugs and those glitches, but also just the hardware, a la the Joy-Cons failing, and having to essentially establish processes to refurbish those, to send them back, to receive them, and essentially take a big loss on those at first. That's something that they're not going to allow to happen again. And with the leaks being as accurate as they have been, I see no reason to doubt the idea that these kind of rumored Hall effect joysticks that are supposed to eliminate the potential for drift is a part of the plan, right? And so I think people who are hung up on the Joy-Cons are maybe not allowing themselves to experience the full range of getting excited for this console based on something that's probably not actually an issue, right? And so I think that that's something to consider when you're thinking about it. If you are concerned about the Joy-Cons, is that, you know, Occam's razor, does it seem more likely that Nintendo has done nothing to prevent another Joy-Con type fiasco? Or does it seem likely that they've taken steps to prevent that in the 7 years since the console released? I suspect that they've taken some steps, but, you know, different strokes for different folks, right? I think another thing is I heard a lot about was the screen scratching from the dock and people concerned that maybe that was going to be a factor. I'm going to be just straight up real with people and say I've never experienced that before. I've had a number of different Switches because I had, I think at one point, the Animal Crossing one, the Mario Collector one, just like the classic black dock and the orange and blue Joy-Con Switch. I never scratched the screen, right? It's like a plastic screen. And so I think this all kind of comes down to and ties nicely into the new concern, which is these Joy-Con connector pads. And it's hard to describe this without a visual, but because this is an audio podcast, I'm going to have to. But it's with the new magnetic way that the Joy-Cons attach to the Switch 2, you'll see in all the renders that on the body of the Switch 2 console, there's sort of almost like an SD card style, you know, plastic thing that juts out from the side with contacts on it that the controllers fit around, right? And I think there's some concern that, oh, those are going to snap off, right? Or those are going to be a point of failure. And again, I don't think that's impossible. And in fact, I think that it's likely that many people will have that happen. But in terms of whether or not it will be such a common point of failure as to be like a recallable sort of Joy-Con drift-esque level controversy, I don't think that that's going to be the case, right? I would imagine for Nintendo to put those sorts of things on the console, understanding the importance of this launch for like their bottom line moving forward, given that the Switch 1 can't survive, right? And so it's not like the 3DS carried the Wii U, right? It's not like, there's another thing just around the corner. It's been 7 years, right? They need to get this right. I would suspect the engineering team put a little effort into making sure that those things aren't just going to snap right off. But if you are concerned about them snapping right off, and if you are concerned about screen scratching, you are concerned about Joy-Con drift, I would suggest a few things. And these are going to sound a little crass, but I'm going to suggest them. Number one is to try to take better care of your stuff. Because I think I'm not personally worried about that. But if I were, when I was putting the Joy-Cons back on, I would take a beat and I would say, okay, let me just make sure that I'm not putting this in at an angle, that I'm not doing this the wrong way, right? And that I'm being thoughtful in how I'm reattaching these Joy-Cons. I think that that's sort of my thought process with that, and why I'm not worried about it is because I think between me, being grown and knowing to be careful with things that I'm worried about, and between Nintendo not wanting to have to pay, millions of dollars to refurbish a mass amount of these Nintendo Switch 2's, I suspect that between the two of us, we can meet in the middle at a place where I will not break those off, right? That said, if you are still worried about those, and you're worried about screen scratching and all of that, you could buy a screen protector, right? Assuming this thing's going to come out and cost about $350, a $10 investment on the screen protector or $5 investment on the screen protector probably will do you good if you're worried about screen scratching, right? And so that's also very, very preventable if you find that is a concern that you have. And I say these things not to be condescending, but just because I think that so many times you see people who are getting caught up in all of the things that could go wrong, that they're allowing it to impact their ability to appreciate the fact that you're living through another console life cycle, right? It's exciting when game consoles come out. When PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X came out, that was such a hype time. It sucked that nobody could get it because of scalpers in the pandemic, but it was an exciting time to be into video games. And the Switch 2 especially, given the drama of the leaks and the hype and sort of the life cycle of the Switch 1 and sort of what it means for this company to put that out, I think it's a super exciting time. But there are a lot of people who are getting really in the weeds about stuff. It's sort of freaking themselves out and robbing themselves of some of the joy that comes with this sort of thing, right? And so I say those things just to sort of remind you that there are steps that can be taken. And push comes to shove, at the end of the day, if you are really worried that your Switch is going to have some catastrophic failure and that you're going to be out your money, just buy the warranty, right? When the guy at GameStop says, hey, for $10 extra, you have the Power Up Pro replacement plan, whatever it is, make his day. Surprise him and say yes. Say, yes, I would like to be able to return this if I have any problems within the next year or whatever it is, right? Because that is ultimately the point of the service. And so I think for people who are really concerned about the hardware in this way, and I'm engaging as if these concerns are in good faith, because that's really the only way to do it, that would be my recommendation. My professional recommendation is to get the warranty, right? But I think that that's very base take for you, is if you're worried about the physical condition of your things, be careful with them and also get a warranty. And I can already hear the comments now, all one of them, of people who say, well, you also got to think about kids, right? If you give this thing to a kid, is it going to survive? And I would say that this is on the parents, right? I'm a grown man. I don't have kids. I don't intend to have kids. But if I were a parent, I would think critically about what value item am I going to give to a child who may or may not be old enough to appreciate the responsibility that comes with having an item that costs a lot of money, right? If I had a Nintendo Switch Lite, that's a fine thing to give to a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old. If I have a, let's say a Leapfrog educational toy with the bumpers and the pages that you press on are made out of plastic so you can't rip them, that's a fine thing to give to a kid. But if I have a brand new $350 game console that I suspect could be broken in a number of ways that would be pretty trivial for a 3 or 4-year-old to break or a 5 or 6-year-old to break, am I going to give that kid that Switch in handheld mode? Or am I going to buy a cheap wireless PowerA controller, put it high on a shelf on the dock, and say, listen, if you want to play the Nintendo, you play the Nintendo like this on the TV, and then when you get older, you can play it handheld, right? I just feel like that's a very reasonable step to take. Because unfortunately, even for people who have children, is you can't manufacture every product that a child might use for children, right? You can't do it. You can't, baby-proof the world. And so there's going to be some stuff that you've just got to use some parental judgment on. And that's just the way it is. And I think when it comes to like a new game console, hey, the way that you have the controllers attached to the console is potentially vulnerable to the attacks of a 6-year-old. Sure. But I've seen so many videos where, a parent is talking about how their kid like poured Gatorade into their PlayStation or something like that, right? Like it's ubiquitous. You see it all over the place that this sort of thing happens. And it just mostly comes down to, are you being smart about the expense of items that you are putting in the hands of your child? And if you're concerned about its ability to break without you being able to fix it or get it replaced by a warranty, you should probably not be giving it to your 4 or 5-year-old. That's the hot take. If you're worried about the safety or the durability of the Switch 2 with children, do not give your children a Switch 2. Wait for the Switch 2 Lite to come out that they can throw around the room like an iPad on a construction site, right? It's just my hot take on that. But anyway, so the real thing that we want to talk about here, though, is the graphics. Because I think I've seen a lot of sort of concern trolling about the graphics on the Switch 2, which I can understand to an extent, right? I think that with the Switch 1, there's sort of this exhaustion from the lack of updates on the console to this point. And I think you look at some games that run on the Switch 1 and they really show their age. Even recently, less recently for me, I want to say, I forget which year it is, but the MLB The Show game that had Ohtani on the cover. So this is probably like 2 years ago, 3 years ago at this point. That version of MLB The Show, if you play that on the Nintendo Switch 1 in handheld mode, it is unbelievably ugly, right? Like the line is jagged, like the foul line is not a straight line. It looks like when you're trying to draw a diagonal line in Microsoft Paint, right? Like it looks terrible. And so I understand some of the lethargy and the just exhaustion around graphics and Nintendo. And it feels like because we're so far removed from the launch of the Switch 1, that this is a bigger problem than it probably is, especially when it comes to the Switch 2, right? And so based on everything we know about the Nintendo Switch 2, the specs that have leaked are relatively interesting, right? And so Polygon says it uses an NVIDIA custom Tegra T239 processor, which yields roughly the power of a PS4, but it's said that it uses upscaling technology when docked that can boost 720p up to 4K. I don't know how that works, but it upscales it to look like 4K, and it has, in the docked mode, about the power of the Steam Deck OLED, right? Now, I'm not a tech guy. I don't know enough about those things to get much more in depth than that. But in my opinion, like PS4 quality graphics in a handheld still sort of feels like a dream. We talked about like the Game Boy Advance SP. I remember playing that and thinking that was as good as things would get. And then we had the PSP and I was like, oh my God, this is a revelation. And so the idea that you can take a PS4 quality game on the go, I know that Steam Deck's out now, but like it will never stop being impressive to me, though it probably will. And then to have the Steam Deck OLED in a docked mode with potential for like upscaling to 4K, like all of that in my head is just like green lights. Like, yeah, that's fine. It's not going to blow the doors off the competition. It's not going to, be able to run the Indiana Jones game fully ray trace. Like, it's not going to be able to do any of those things. But I also, and sort of the thesis of this video is that I don't really care. And I don't care because I think that focusing so heavily on graphics when it comes to game consoles sort of misses what makes game consoles exciting to begin with. And I mean, in this case, particularly misses what makes, the new Nintendo Switch exciting to begin with. But I think there's sort of this thing that's happened now where the OG console wars, which were more just like, I don't know, I feel like they were sort of valid insofar as there were at times pretty stark technical differences between the consoles. And there was a more defined sort of line of what games you could or could not play on those consoles in terms of exclusives. Like in the 90s, it was like you could play Sonic on Sega and that's it. If you wanted to play Sonic, you were having a Sega console, right? If you wanted to play Mario, you had a Nintendo console. That's it. In the 2000s, it's like you want to play Spyro, your ass is getting a PlayStation, right? If you want to play, Halo, you're getting an Xbox. There wasn't a lot of play between the two. Of course, sports games, that sort of thing, there were always cross-platform games. But largely, you were getting a different experience on each console. But in 2025, it's sort of not that way, right? Xbox is frankly a dying brand, which pains me to say as like an OG Xbox sort of loyalist. But Xbox seems to be going the way of Sega. Like, we're talking about having Halo on the Switch 2 and Halo on the PlayStation, and that doesn't matter. I'm glad that more people can play it, and I understand why the business makes sense for that, right? You want as many people to be able to give you money for your game as possible, and Xbox is not selling the consoles right now. So if Sony is, let's sell the games. Like, I get that portion of it. But as like a millennial who grew up with that sort of divide with the console wars, I 100% feel some type of way deep in my soul about seeing Master Chief on a PlayStation. That just, it does not feel right. And, not in a serious way, just in a, right in the childhood, right? And so Xbox is sort of abandoning the idea of exclusivity altogether. And their sort of purchase of Call of Duty could have been sort of a revival of that. But instead, because of like antitrust laws, that's sort of the opposite, right? It's like they're buying it and they'll have like a sort of limited exclusivity window, but it's always going to come to PlayStation. But PlayStation 5, while it's been much more successful and it's not a dying brand, has only in 4-ish years since it released had 22 exclusive titles, right? And so the Xbox is like just not doing exclusives anymore. The PlayStation has about, and this is a rough number because it's based on the Wikipedia list of PlayStation 5 exclusives. So might be higher, might be lower. But 22 in four and some change years is, I don't know. That doesn't feel like it's offering a lot of variety. When you look, like some of those are like The Last of Us remastered, there's just like, for me, there's no compelling case to be made that the experience you're getting on PlayStation is necessarily better than the experience you're getting on Xbox outside of like just sort of preference, right? And so another thing to bring up, and this is, obviously apples to oranges, but in the 8 years since Switch released, the console's generated over 250 exclusives. And that's not to say that the Switch is better than other consoles, but more to illustrate that even though it's at like a significant graphical disadvantage, it has like quite a bit that it can offer that neither of those other two consoles can. And I think that that's something to think about, is that when you're thinking, oh, well, the Switch 2 is underpowered, right? And sorry if I've been saying Switch 2 instead of Switch 1, I apologize. But the Switch 1, in the 8 years since it's been released, has generated over 250 exclusives. But you can talk about, oh, well, it's underpowered compared to the PlayStation. It's underpowered compared to the Xbox. But in the time, since it's released 250 exclusive games, that's sort of the secret to why it sold so well, right? Is that you can buy an Xbox, you can buy a PlayStation, most of the people who buy those consoles are playing Call of Duty, they're playing 2K, they're playing Madden, right? Like they buy the consoles to essentially play the same games as one another. Fortnite, all of these free-to-play games that are cross-platform now, it's sort of killed the idea that there's some novel experience on PlayStation that you absolutely cannot get on Xbox or vice versa, right? And so without exclusives, without the sort of old school vibe of like, you can only get this here, if we really are trying to think about why we prefer one thing over another, if it becomes like a race for like who has the most powerful hardware, then you would just get the PC, right? Like there's no reason not to, if you care about the performance of the machine and you care about the types of games you're going to play, like there's no reason you wouldn't just get a PC. And so that's sort of the thing that always sticks with me when we talk about, oh, well, this is underpowered, or, you know, this console is better than the other console. It's like, listen, I get where you're coming from as like a brand loyalist in a lot of ways. But at the same time, it's like, it seems like you're, you know, one of those soldiers from Japan who was on the island and didn't know that World War II ended, right? Because at the end of the day, you have an option to play the same exact games at much higher fidelity with unlimited storage, with the ability to upgrade parts and keep all of your data intact, right? There's no monthly subscription fee. When Steam does its summer sales, its winter sales, its spring sales, you're often saving, you know, 50 to 80 to 90% on games that you want to play. You have the built-in functionality of it being a computer. You can edit video on it. You can do whatever you want on it, right? And so if we're having an argument about like what's the most powerful, or like does the most powerful console, like, does that matter? I don't think it does, because if it did matter, if the reason you chose your game console was based on the raw power of the thing, then you would get a PC, you know? And I'm not usually that guy. I was never that guy. I'm not like a PC master race guy, right? But like, it's obvious that if you want the most powerful gaming experience, you will get a gaming PC. But that's not why people do it, right? There's some sort of brand loyalty involved. There's some sort of, you know, desire to play that catalog of games involved, right? They like the form factor, right? There's any number of reasons somebody could. There's cost, right? Though I would argue that the difference between the cost of a PS5 Pro and the amount of money you will save in subscription fees and purchasing games on year one, I think it makes up the difference, right? I think that it's bar none going to essentially equate to whatever it costs for you to get a pretty good gaming PC that matches or exceeds any of the current gen consoles right now. And in chat, Sturkey said it well. So PC also has emulation, right? And so it has emulation. It has the ability you can watch movies, you can watch TV shows, you can download stuff. The other thing is complete and perfect backwards compatibility. You look at the Xbox, and if you want to play certain games on the Xbox Series X from legacy Xboxes, you can. I'm not read in enough to the PlayStation sort of ecosystem to know if that's true for sure for PlayStation 5, but you have no concerns about backwards compatibility with the PC outside of maybe some like Windows compatibility stuff. But I ran Hoyle Casino 98 on my Windows 11 PC with my 4060. Like, anything is possible. And if you don't like what games are out there, you could make your own on a PC, right? And so if you care about graphics, if you care about experience, if what you want is the perfect gaming experience, you're going to go for a PC every time. And so it sort of falls on deaf ears with me when people talk about, oh, well, the Switch 2 is just, you know, it looks like a disaster because it only runs as a handheld PS4, right? Or it only runs at, you know, upscaled 4K resolution when in docked mode, right? And so if we can agree, and I think we can, I think reasonable people can agree that the only reason you buy your gaming console is not the graphical power. We can say that there are other factors that play in, right? Then in our quest to figure out, does it matter if the Switch's graphics aren't the best graphics in the world? I think we can say that, you know, that one point, we can say, well, that's not it, right? But so if graphics don't inherently make a console better, what about the games, right? do graphics make the games better? And so I did a little research, a quick 5 minutes, and I went on Metacritic. And now Metacritic, all of the necessary disclosures, all of the necessary like asterisks there, that it's not a perfect 100% gospel rating of the top games. And I'm sure there are many places where I disagree with the list, you would disagree with the list, but it is a source for this information with 5 minutes research for a podcast that nobody listens to. And so we're going to go with it. But so according to Metacritic, 8 of the top 20 rated games of all time are Nintendo games. Now, that's not to say Nintendo is better than other companies. That's not what I'm saying with this. But what I'm saying is that Nintendo is known for selling underpowered hardware graphically since way back, right? And that the systems that powered the games that are on this list were also underpowered compared to the generation that they were competing in. And so, great example off the bat, Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 come in at numbers 4 and 5 on the list. Both of them were on the Wii, which was essentially just the GameCube with motion controls. And this was in the console generation with the Xbox 360 and the PS3, which were like, if you weren't around for the launches of those, I remember going and playing the PS3 kiosk at my local GameStop and being like, oh my God, it cannot get better than this. I forget which game it was, but the PS3 at the time was like a ridiculous $700. And I remember going and playing this like four-wheeler off-road racing game on the kiosk at GameStop and thinking, this is as good as graphics can possibly get. This is unbelievable. And that was the narrative around the PS3 and the Xbox 360, is that this is a crazy generation of games and we will never see anything like this again. And the Wii was like, it's fun. You can bowl on this thing, right? But the Wii was the one that had people busting down the door at Best Buy during Black Friday, right? It was so difficult to get Nintendo Wii hardware that holiday season. I remember I got a Wii that Christmas, and my parents apparently had to work with my uncle in another state who was in the military who could buy one on the base. And he bought it and shipped it. And it was a whole sort of Rube Goldberg situation of factors that had to go just right for me to get this for Christmas, because it was sold out everywhere. And this is pre-eBay scalpers as we know them, right? And so one of the most popular consoles the most popular console that year, one of the most popular consoles of all time, notoriously underpowered when it comes to graphics, completely outgunned when it comes to graphics in that generation, and numbers 4 and 5 on the best video games of all time, according to Metacritic. And so that doesn't match up, right? If graphics are what matters. And then numbers 6 and 13 are Switch games. So there's Breath of the Wild and Mario Odyssey. Now, Breath of the Wild technically is a Wii U game, right? And Mario Odyssey is, one of the earliest titles on the Nintendo Switch. But with the Nintendo Switch 2 now reporting to have PS4 level graphics, I think it's pretty obvious that the Nintendo Switch 1, which came out during the Xbox One PS4 generation of games, was obviously also outgunned in that generation. But again, it's number 6 and 13 on the best games of all time, according to Metacritic. Once again, that's not the gospel. Reasonable people can disagree about whether that's true. But just in terms of how they are viewed on like a macro level, this is a good way to look at it. And now I'll compare to the other killer app from that generation. Obviously, the Xbox One really kind of sputtered out in that generation. The PS4 was huge. PS4 is one of the best game consoles ever made. The PS4's killer app was The Last of Us. The Last of Us was graphically stunning at the time, and still is. If you were to play it on the PS4, it looks great, right? They knew what they were doing. The Last of Us comes in at number 44 on that same list. And so, again, I'm not saying that The Last of Us is worse than Breath of the Wild or Mario Odyssey. I don't have a strong opinion on the veracity of this list. What I'm saying is there's a large contingent of people for whom obviously the graphical horsepower of the console is not necessarily the be-all, end-all. And that I think it's limiting to your scope when you think about game consoles, when you think about your ability to enjoy a console. If you look at the hardware and see that it's not like the bleeding edge of technology and think, oh, well, that's not worth my time. because I think that I could probably ask you what your favorite game is and why. And while the visuals might be a part of it, I think that there's probably more than that. I know for me personally, my two favorite games are Gears of War for the Xbox 360, the original one, and then Mario 64 for the N64, which should come as no surprise, given I have a Nintendo YouTube channel. But what I will say is that Gears of War for the Xbox 360 is a game that, while so many facets of it are amazing, right? When you look back at it, you can kind of see how it was really dark, like visually. And it had that sort of like bloom that all games from that era had. That sort of like, I don't know how to describe it other than like, I'm listening to Seether and Linkin Park and, drinking some Surge soda and like, not Surge soda, some Mountain Dew. Like, it is a vibe of that era to have that sort of like lens flare grittiness applied to the camera in the way that Gears of War does, right? At the time, the graphics looked cool. It was like one of the better looking games that there were. However, in retrospect, maybe not the best. But when I think about the reasons I like that game, I don't really think that much about the fact that it looked really good. I remember as a kid thinking, wow, this looks awesome. But the reason I liked the game at the time was because it was like a little scary, right? You had a chainsaw, you were cutting guys in half, and that was like new and creative. The third person camera and the way it followed you, the cover system and the way that you could take cover, the shotgun and how it made multiplayer combat like close up. And when you shoot, it blows them to smithereens and chunks and stuff, right? Like, it was something new and something different and a novel gameplay experience. And so, couple that with, to some extent, yes, graphically it looked good. I feel like the reason I liked that game was because of the game more than it was the wrapper. And I think you can look further than that and say, I know somebody who's in the community a lot, Sturkey, he was playing, what was it called, BattleBit for a long time. And BattleBit is like Roblox graphics, but it's like compelling gameplay with like this massive sort of like open world war that you fight in or something like that. So graphics like matter insofar as you don't want them to be like completely terrible. But is it something that should be, especially when, and let's back up and contextualize what we have here, what it is we're talking about here, is we're talking about a console that is handheld mode, a PS4, and then docked is Steam Deck OLED that can be upscaled to 4K resolution, allegedly, right? And so it's not like we're talking about this has the graphical quality of a PS3, right? It's not like we're talking about this was like, Nintendo DS to Nintendo GameCube jump in graphical quality. Like, it is still great looking, right? It's just not running like a 4060. And so when I hear the sort of equivocation about, oh, well, the Switch 2's graphics are going to kill the console. Who's going to want to play this? It's not going to be able to compete with the Steam Deck. It's not going to be able to compete with this. I would just say that doesn't feel right? That doesn't feel correct. That doesn't feel like it understands or is even attempting to understand. And that's why I said I'm treating these arguments as if they're in good faith, but I suspect a lot of them aren't. But you have to treat them that way because otherwise it's nothing to talk about. But it's just a thing to consider. And sort of when I'm thinking about this, it's the logic behind sort of why I see that. And I'm not like, oh my God, that's the worst thing I've ever heard. Because there are some people who feel that way. And also it's just, I want to create a space where I'm saying, hey, listen, this is good. This is a positive thing people should be excited about. And I know many people are excited about this without some dude on the internet telling them to be. But also I understand that there's sort of the way that the internet sort of warps your opinions on things, right? When I was looking into building my computer, it's like, oh, well, I'm going to get the 4060. But then you look online and you have some people who are like, the 4060 is the worst. It's the worst of the graphics cards. You're not getting your bang for your buck. You should save up and you should get this card because it's going to be, you're going to look at the 4060 and wish you hadn't, right? And then I got the computer with the 4060 and I booted up Call of Duty and I could see the fog and zombies like rolling over the water. And I was like, this is crazy. Like, this is insane to me. And so, I do think that there is sort of that. There's a really great video by, I forget this guy's name, but he talks about what it's like to be on Reddit. And he goes into the I drink water subreddit. And he says, hey guys, I'm thinking about getting into drinking water. Like, is there anything I should know? And the first post that replies to him is somebody saying something like, oh, well, you want to really make sure that you're adjusting for temperature. I think you don't want to do any more than 67.5 degrees. If you go below that, it's too cold. If you go above that, it's too hot. And then, of course, you have to think about the different container you want your thing to be in. And so on one hand, you're going to have the verties. On the other hand, you're going to have the hories. The hories are a little short, but they hold more water in terms of width. And then the hories, they're a little tall, but they're a little bit more narrow. And so it's really going to be up to you in terms of what you want. But the meta opinion is that people like the hories, right? And just kind of like lampooning the idea that it is very much so a thing where when you're in these niche communities of people who are all very passionate about a thing, that you have this situation where there is no, oh, well, that's good enough, right? It's just like you are getting either the best of the best thing or you have work to do, right? It's like, I only have a 40/60. And so someday I'm going to save up, I'm going to get a 50/90, and then I can come in here and say, I've got the biggest, best thing, right? And I just think that that's part of the culture in sort of this tech gaming space that's like not the best. And so I was feeling a little passionate about it because I was seeing posts and people are like, the Switch 2 announcement was such a letdown. And I'm like, they showed us a 2-minute video. We know what it looks like. Let them let us down first. Let them disappoint us. Give us the chance to be disappointed before you're disappointed, right? And that's sort of where I landed on it. And so that was really the meat and potatoes of what I wanted to talk about today, was just sort of a critical thinking approach to, are the graphics on the Switch 2 bad, right? Like, should we be concerned about the graphics on the Switch 2? I don't think so. And that's really it. That's my summary. I don't think so. But I mean, maybe you are. Maybe you really wanted a, fully ray traced 1080p, 120 frames per second Super Mario. And you know what? I'm sorry we're not going to get that. But someday you're going to be able to count the blades of grass on Bob-omb Battlefield. And you're going to be able to see the sweat drip off of Yoshi's forehead as he's forced to carry Mario across a large gap. And you're going to be able to really read the fear and the betrayal and the sadness in his eyes when Mario kicks off of him to jump across the gap and reach that kind of slidey pole thing that you want to hit the top to get the most points, right? And then you'll be happy. And then you can rest. But in the meantime, I feel like the Switch 2 graphics are probably fine. And that's my thought. So yeah, cool. So that's the podcast.